mentioned in the past how, in a sense, it's another element of this disconnect, but it's from a different source, and that modern man is disconnected from the notion of the supernatural versus the natural, and how that gets worked out in, the lunar is related more to the supernatural, and the natural is related more to the sun. How do you explain all that, Brian? What's your notion of that?
Well, here we go again back to the Jewish festivals and the Jewish calendar. It's important to understand it's a lunar calendar, and all the festivals are based on the moon. There's a concept where the moon refers to Jesus and the Father refers to the Son. The S-U-N, Son. Now, Jesus said he was the truth, the way, and the life. Now, if you consider navigation, for example, it is possible to navigate all around the world, obviously with the moon and the stars. But it's also possible to tell with some special old devices of antiquity your longitude with these devices without the elements of having a clock to know where you are longitudinally as well as latitudinally. And this is spoken quite a bit in a book called Seaman's Secrets, of how the old sailors used to navigate around the world and therefore demonstrate that many years before Columbus, sailors were traveling all over the world with these simple instruments as their guideposts.
And so what's the implications of this on modern man? What are you saying? What are you saying about modern society?
Well, Jesus is not only the way to eternal life, if we allegor him to the moon, he's also the way to travel around the world. And again, allegorically, also the way to live your life.
You wanted to talk a little bit about the Jewish versus Christian creation story. What interests you in that?
What the Jewish creation story and the creation story tell us is that there are two women that were created before Eve. And there are many other differences between the two creation stories, and the Christian creation story is somewhat edited from the Jewish creation story. I just like to comment about who knows the Old Testament better than anybody else is that the Jews or the Christians. So whose story is most correct? There's other things I want to say about what happened in the beginning, and particularly relates to after Adam and Eve were created and the fall came, or what was called original sin. The two of them took within to their bodies the forbidden fruit, which gave rise to the 7 cardinal sins, which Paul referred to as the law of sins, and law of sin, and this is active 24/7. The next thing Adam and Eve did was they covered themselves because they felt shame. Now I wonder, did they feel shame in their bodies, or did they feel shame in themselves because of the sin that was contained within them? The next thing they did is went and hid from God. So now we have the 7 cardinal sins, the 7 shames associated with each cardinal sin, and the 7 fears associated with each cardinal sin. And like I say, or I haven't said yet, but fear is the driving force to sin, to the cardinal sins, and shame is like a doorway that depends on how far the door is open, how much fear will get through. And how much fear you have depends on the power that's available to drive the sin. You'll also remember that Eve blamed the serpent, and Adam blamed Eve, and then blamed God. So here you have, right from the very beginning, the breakdown of relationship, not only between men and women, but between man and God. You may also want to consider that man and woman were created to be partners, not one lording it over each one. The partnership started to fall apart, of course, at the fall, with man to this very day persecuting women, and women in response manipulating man primarily through sex. So now we've gone full blown until we say that sex has no holiness to it. It's important to realize that God created sex between men and women. Men and women didn't come up with it on their own. It was built into creation so that man and woman could be fruitful in terms of bearing children. Man is in a constant search for his identity and where he belongs. In the days of the cottage industry, everybody had their own place in the society and everybody knew where they fit in. And so they had a complete identity not in only in who they were, but in what they did and where they fell into society. When the factory industry came along and men in general started to go and work in factories, they began to lose their identity. And the farther we go in the development of our material world, the more and more men identify themselves by what they do instead of who they are and where they fit in. Sooner or later you're going to get to a point where nobody knows who they are or where they get in, where they fit in, and now we're seeing that in a graphic way just by looking around the society we have. Everybody just wandering around seemingly doing their own thing, not realizing that we really are dependent on each other to have the world we live in. I use the example, if you're in the bathroom, how many people does it take to do the paperwork? Well, you might consider only one, but when you consider where that roll of toilet paper came from, you might want to consider what's behind it, so that there may very well be 40 million people cheering you on as you do your work. Now consider that roll of toilet paper was originally a tree. So if you can't even do the paperwork without God's help, how do you consider that you're going to get to heaven without God's help?